All right, last homework question from chapter 22 is number 21, in which this question references number 20, which references a figure 22-3 in the book. So there's a little bit of following to do to get all the information, the background information to answer the question. Sorry about that, but I see this as an opportunity to tie in just the simple formulas that I've been focused on with a slightly different approach that the book uses, and that lets you see how these things actually do all tie in together and helps you get each part probably, I hope, maybe a little bit more thoroughly by doing it this way. So here we go. In problem 22-20, which we don't need to do, but you can look back there; it's right there. If the firm were to employ the eighth unit of labor and produce 380 units of output, what would be the average variable cost and the marginal cost? I'm always interested in the cost curves, how they relate to each other, more than I'm interested in things that are in that figure. Like, to me, I don't find the average product is very useful going forward with the later chapters that we're about to get into. But it's something you can explore, and then it helps you to get these a little better, okay? So if you look at number 20, what it says there in the beginning of that is that we're referring to figure 22-3, which is on page 497 of the book, and it looks exactly like this, except this one has some of my handwriting on it, extreme close-up. Right? That's what we're referring back to. And he says that suppose they brought in an eighth unit of labor and they made 380 units of output, okay? So it's basically, what we're talking about is just adding a row on the bottom of this table. Well, if you look at the table and you were to add a row, you would fill in the eighth unit of labor. That's just going from 7 to 8. You just write an 8 there. That's what you would fill in. Total product, it's the output with that eighth laborer, is 380. Okay, and that was just given in the question, 22-21. And then the book's way, one way the author does things is to get this average product. Well, he tells you in that table that the average product is the total product divided by the number of workers. It's worker output. It's output per worker on an average. I don't find that very useful, but we can use it here to tease out. Just looking at getting our average variable cost a different way. Well, that would be 47.5. That is the 380 divided by 8. That's also right there in the question. You don't necessarily have to look back at the table if you were to memorize what average product is. It's the worker output, average worker output. And then the marginal product. Well, it used to be that we were making, with 7 workers, we were making 360 units. We added an 8th worker. And it's right here in the question. Now we're making 380 units. Well, if we used to be making 360 units, now we're making 380 units. How many output units, how many units did that worker bring to the table? 20 units. And so this is just, I'm referring back to the beginning of the chapter and then going, sort of summarizing everything we've done a little bit. The production function, as you add laborers, you increase output, but you increase at a decreasing rate. So bringing in this worker, the marginal product of this worker is 20 units, which is, if you're filling in the table, that would be the next piece of the table that you would fill in. The first part of the actual question, though, is average variable cost. For 22, 21, average variable cost is what we're interested in. And so we were given across the question and the table that the wage rate is $1,000. That's what it takes to bring in this 8th worker. It's $1,000. And we're talking about bringing in the 8th worker, and there are 8 workers now at $1,000 each. So your total variable cost is the $1,000 times now 8 workers. I only have 5 fingers on my hand, so I'm trying to say this is 8, okay? So your total variable cost then is $8,000 because it's 8 workers at $1,000 each. I'm approaching this a little differently than these columns. I'll circle back to that figure. So your variable costs are $8,000. And how much stuff are you making? The quantity was given in the question, 380 units. So your average variable cost is equal to your variable costs over your quantity, and it's $8,000 divided by 380 is how much you're making. That was given in the question, and that division, when you do that on a calculator, you get 21.05. Now, that's the way I approach this. I think of these average variable cost, average fixed cost equal average total cost, because variable cost plus fixed cost equal total cost. Marginal cost is then by change in total cost or by change in quantity. Those are basically the big, call it 6, 7 variables that I use to answer these questions. That's my approach. If you look at the text and filling in the columns, what he does for column 5 in figure 22-3, you can all go back and reference that. He divides the wage rate of that 8th worker, $1,000, by the average product of workers. But the average product of workers isn't useful for anything but approaching this. The point is, if you do it his way and do that, you also get 21.05. So hopefully, if you're looking at the book and looking at what I've been doing with average variable cost or an average fixed cost and saying this doesn't line up, now I'm trying to tie it all together, because you can approach this different ways and arrive at the same conclusion. Through the next 3 chapters, approaching it with these, I think, is going to be more useful. I know it's going to be more useful. Hopefully that's making sense. Then the last thing that we're asked is for the marginal cost of producing this 380th unit. A part of why I wanted to do this question is because at last we're not changing our output by just 1 unit. I think that's what we've done in the other questions, and that's slightly unrealistic. You're bringing in an 8th worker. The 8th worker is going to cost you $1,000. Marginal cost is change in total cost over the change in quantity. You're bringing in an 8th worker who's going to cost you $1,000 to bring in. So what's the change in total cost? It's $1,000. That's what it costs to bring in this person. What's this person bringing to the table? Not the same as the last person brings to the table, because we have diminishing marginal returns to labor. This person brings to the table, according to the table, 380 units is what you'll produce by bringing in this 8th person. When you only had 7, you were producing 360. So your change in output is 380 minus 360. And so you're talking about 1,000 divided by 20. And this cancels out, this cancels out. And so 100 divided by 2 is equal to 50. So your marginal cost of producing what this person brings to the table in the production function is $50 a unit. That's what it's costing you. This is a great springboard for our next chapter, because our next chapter is called Perfect Competition, and that's where we begin to look at, well, should you do this? Should you bring in this 8th worker? Well, the answer is like so many things. Well, it depends. It depends on what you can get for it. If producing those units brings you more than $50 per unit, that is, if the price exceeds $50, you would say, yes, let's do this. If you can't get $50 per unit, you would not bring in this 8th worker. So marginal cost, I'd mentioned at the beginning of all of this, the marginal things are what make decisions happen about whether or not to open or close or how many units to produce. The averages, average total cost, average fixed cost, those things, those are just the simple calculations, and that's what's nice about them. But the marginal things, that's where the action is. That's why this is the last homework question, is because this gives us the springboard to go right into the next chapter. And now what we'll be doing with the next chapter is comparing marginal cost, which we just looked at yet another way, to marginal revenue, and I'm going to make it a cliffhanger.